The jungle does not care what the Pentagon promised. In the summer of 1967, Marines near Con Tien and along the DMZ pulled the charging handles on their new rifles and heard nothing but a dead click. Reports from the field described Marines caught beside jammed rifles, jamming cleaning rods down the barrel in a desperate attempt to knock a stuck cartridge case free. This was not supposed to happen. The M16 had been sold to Congress and to the American public as the future of the infantry rifle. Lighter than the old M14, capable of full automatic fire, built for a new kind of war in a new kind of jungle. And yet, in the worst possible moment, it was failing. Letters home talked about rifles that jammed after a few rounds. Some Marines begged their families to send them WD-40 because the Army had not yet issued proper cleaning kits. By the time the story reached Washington, it was no longer a rumor. It was a scandal serious enough to trigger a congressional investigation. A weapon built to replace the old and trusted M14 was killing the reputation of the men who designed it before it had a chance to prove anything. And yet, somehow, this same rifle did not disappear. It did not get quietly retired the way failed weapons usually are. Instead, it was rebuilt, reissued, and eventually became the standard rifle of the United States military for decades to come. Investigators who later reviewed accounts from the field found something almost impossible to accept. Many of the men affected had not been careless. They had cleaned their rifles as best they could with what little they had, and the weapons still betrayed them. A rifle is supposed to be the one piece of equipment a soldier can trust without question. For a brief, terrible period in 1967, American fighting men could not make that assumption, and it nearly cost the M16 its future before that future had even properly begun. The question is not why the M16 failed in Vietnam. The question is why, after failing so badly in front of Congress and the entire country, the United States military refused to let it die. To understand why the M16 should have vanished, you have to understand what it was competing against. Before the M16, American riflemen carried the M14, a rugged, full-sized battle rifle firing a heavy 7.62mm round, a direct descendant of the M1 Garand that had carried American soldiers through World War II and Korea. The M14 was accurate, powerful, and trusted by an older generation of officers who had built their careers around it. But Vietnam exposed problems that the M14 was never designed to solve. It was heavy. It kicked hard on full automatic, so hard that most soldiers could barely control it. Soldiers could only carry a limited number of the heavy 7.62 rounds compared to the lighter ammunition of a new rifle design. Meanwhile, military planners were watching a new doctrine take shape, one built around speed, mobility, and high volumes of fire in close jungle terrain, where firefights often erupted at ranges of 50 yards or less. Eugene Stoner's AR-15 design, adopted by the Air Force and then the Army as the M16, promised exactly that. It was light. It used a small, high-velocity 5.56mm round that let a soldier carry twice as much ammunition for the same weight. On paper, it was everything the modern infantryman needed. Institutional logic said the M14 was obsolete, that the age of the heavy battle rifle was over, and that the M16 represented the inevitable future of American small arms. By every measure that mattered to the planners in Washington, the M16 should have been an easy, permanent replacement. Then it met the battlefield, and the battlefield exposed a problem that no amount of paperwork could hide. The rifle that reached Vietnam was still Stoner's basic design, but it was not being fielded under the conditions that design had been tested and promoted for. Ammunition specifications were quietly changed from the original stick powder to a different ball powder, which fouled the action and left carbon buildup that the rifle's design had never been tested against. The rifle shipped without chrome-lined chambers, which meant that in the wet, humid conditions of Southeast Asia, corrosion built up fast. And in one of the most damning failures of the entire program, cleaning kits and maintenance manuals were not issued to troops in large numbers until well into 1967. In some cases, years after the rifle had already been placed in soldiers' hands. Riflemen were told, incorrectly, that this weapon was self-cleaning and needed little maintenance in the field. It was a claim that cost lives. When Congress convened the special subcommittee under Missouri Representative Richard Icord in 1967, the investigation into what became known as the Icord hearings uncovered a picture of institutional failure. One investigator sent to Vietnam by the subcommittee interviewed 250 soldiers and Marines, and roughly half of them reported some kind of malfunction, with the overwhelming majority of those failures being spent cases that would not extract from the chamber. This was the problem the military could not simply engineer around by switching rifles again. It could not escape the fact that a smaller, lighter cartridge and a gas-operated action needed discipline, maintenance, and institutional support to function, support that had been denied to the men carrying it into combat. What is remarkable is not that the M16 failed under these conditions. Almost any rifle would have failed under a broken supply chain, missing cleaning equipment, and a powder change nobody in the field had been warned about. The remarkable part is what happened next. Instead of walking away from the platform entirely, the Army and the manufacturer went back to the fundamentals. Chrome-lined chambers and barrels were introduced to resist corrosion. The buffer system and propellant were revised to reduce fouling. Cleaning kits, brushes, solvents, and proper instruction manuals were finally distributed at scale, backed by training programs that had simply not existed before. The improved rifle, standardized as the M16A1, began reaching units in the field, and reliability improved sharply. This is the part of the story that gets forgotten. The men who had every reason to hate this rifle after watching their friends die holding it did not universally reject it once it was fixed. Many came to trust it precisely because they had seen it fail, and then watched it get corrected under pressure, in real time, in the middle of a war. That kind of trust is different from blind faith in a new piece of technology. It is trust that has been tested and has survived the test. By the later years of the war and into the 1970s, a strange thing had happened. The rifle that had nearly been killed by scandal had become the default weapon of an entire generation of American troops, and the reasons went beyond politics or sunk cost. Soldiers and Marines who carried the M16A1 into the jungle discovered real advantages once the mechanical issues were addressed. Its lightweight and manageable recoil meant a rifleman could carry more ammunition and stay controllable on automatic fire, which mattered enormously in the close, sudden ambushes that defined so much of the fighting in Vietnam. Its high-velocity round, while criticized by traditionalists who preferred the stopping power of the older 7.62, produced a wound pattern that soldiers on the ground came to respect at typical jungle engagement ranges. None of this erased the memory of 1967, but it meant that by the time the war wound down, a rifle that had once been synonymous with Congressional Scandal had also become something else, familiar, understood, and, in the hands of a soldier who had been taught to maintain it properly, dependable. That kind of trust does not transfer automatically from one generation of soldiers to the next. It has to be re-earned every time a new class of recruits picks up the weapon for the first time. What kept the M16 family alive through the decades that followed Vietnam was that each new generation of troops inherited a rifle that had already been fixed, already been explained, and already been built into the training pipeline from day one. By the time the M16A2 arrived in the 1980s, refined with input from Marine Corps marksmanship instructors and battlefield after-action reports, the rifle was no longer the unproven outsider it had been in the jungle. It was the baseline every recruit learned on, the weapon every drill instructor had personally carried, and the standard against which every proposed replacement would now have to prove itself. That inherited familiarity became its own kind of battlefield advantage, one that had nothing to do with muzzle velocity or magazine capacity, and everything to do with the confidence of a soldier who was trained on the same basic system his instructors trained on before him. That reputation was tested again in the 1980s, when the Army launched one of its most ambitious efforts to finally replace the M16 for good. Officers were not satisfied with a rifle whose accuracy dropped off sharply at extended combat ranges, and military researchers set an aggressive goal: find a new rifle system capable of doubling a soldier's probability of hitting a target compared to the standard M16A2. This effort became known as the Advanced Combat Rifle Program, and it attracted some of the sharpest small arms engineering in the world. Steyr of Austria proposed a futuristic bullpup design, firing high-velocity flechette darts instead of conventional bullets. Heckler & Koch brought forward the G11, a radical, caseless ammunition rifle years ahead of its time, a weapon so advanced that some called it the closest thing to science fiction the Cold War ever produced. AAI and Colt entered their own advanced prototypes. The Army spent years and roughly $300 million testing these designs against the standard issue M16A2 under realistic combat conditions. In the end, none of them delivered enough of an improvement to justify replacing the M16A2. None of the exotic new designs delivered the dramatic leap in performance the Army had demanded, and by 1990, the entire program was quietly shut down. The rifle that had once nearly been retired in disgrace had just outlasted the best rifle technology that engineers on 2 continents could produce. Why did this keep happening? Why did some of the most advanced small arms engineers in the world, backed by serious budgets and real institutional pressure to succeed, keep failing to unseat a rifle with such a troubled past? The dark reason is not that the M16 was the best rifle ever designed. It never claimed to be. The dark reason is that combat effectiveness in the real world is rarely decided by the most impressive design on a testing range. It is decided by whether a weapon can be manufactured at scale, maintained by exhausted soldiers in bad weather, repaired with parts that already exist in a supply chain, and trained on quickly by young recruits who have only a few weeks to learn it before deployment. The G11's caseless ammunition was groundbreaking, but it demanded a completely new logistics and manufacturing base, and it never cleared the Army's own performance threshold in the ACR trials. Its fate was sealed further when Germany reunified and defense budgets were redirected, ending West German support for the program that had built the weapon in the first place. The Steyr flechette design was light and fast, but it demanded new ammunition production lines and offered no guarantee of matching the M16 family's proven battlefield record. Newer was not automatically better. It was, in almost every case, a promise that had not yet been tested by the same brutal, unpredictable conditions that had already forged the M16's reputation, for better and worse, over 2 decades of hard use. Even before the ACR program had run its course, the M16 family had already proven itself again under very different conditions. In the open deserts of the 1991 Gulf War, American forces moved fast, fought in extended engagements against a well-armed conventional enemy, and relied on a rifle platform that, by then, had been refined through nearly 2 decades of institutional lessons learned since Vietnam. The complaints were different in the desert than they had been in the jungle. Sand fouling replaced humidity as the environmental enemy, and soldiers again had to be reminded to keep their weapons clean in punishing conditions. But the rifle that emerged from that war did so without anything resembling the scandal of 1967. It had become, by then, simply the tool a soldier expected to work, which was itself a remarkable transformation for a weapon that had once been the subject of congressional hearings. The rifle's survival was reinforced again in the deserts and mountains of Iraq and Afghanistan, where the platform evolved into the shorter, handier M4 Carbine, used by conventional infantry and special operations units alike. Once again, critics argued the design was overdue for replacement, pointing to complaints about stopping power at extended range and the demands of urban and mountain combat. For decades, extensive testing against newer contenders failed to produce a clear enough advantage to justify the enormous cost of rearming the entire force. The pattern from Vietnam through the Cold War and into the War on Terror kept repeating itself. Something newer would emerge, promising a dramatic leap forward, and the aging AR-15 platform, refined generation after generation, would prove difficult to definitively beat where it actually mattered, in the hands of an ordinary soldier, under real conditions, with real logistics behind it. This is why the story of the M16 is not really a story about one rifle. It is a story about what the American military learned, sometimes at a terrible cost, about the difference between a weapon that looks revolutionary in a laboratory and a weapon that has been hardened by decades of actual combat. The M16 survived not because it was flawless. Its darkest chapter, the one written in the jungles of 1967, proved the opposite. It survived because every attempt to replace it ran into the same wall. The immense difficulty of matching a mature, thoroughly tested, thoroughly understood platform with something new that had not yet earned that same trust. Soldiers do not fight with press releases, and they do not win battles with specification sheets. They fight with what has already proven it can be cleaned in the mud, fired in the rain, and repaired in the field by a 19-year-old with a rifle in one hand and a flashlight in the other. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth behind the title of this story. The M16 refused to die not because the men in charge fell in love with it, but because war kept asking the same unforgiving question, over and over, decade after decade. And the rifle, flaws and all, kept finding a way to answer it well enough to survive. Its legacy is now unavoidable. The basic architecture that Eugene Stoner designed and that nearly ended in disgrace on the floor of Congress became the direct ancestor of the M4 Carbine that armed most of the US military for a generation, and one of the most widely used rifle platforms in modern military history. Few weapons have a more complicated origin story. Fewer still have answered that kind of institutional failure with this level of endurance. Even the rifle now being fielded to replace it in America's close combat units has had to prove itself the same hard way, facing its own early scrutiny and controversy before earning a place in the hands of soldiers who grew up trusting the M4. That is the standard the M16 itself was never given the chance to meet in 1967, and the standard it spent the following decades quietly clearing, generation after generation, before finally handing off the torch. The dark reason the M16 refused to die is the same reason so many of America's most trusted weapons have survived long past their expected replacement date. Not because they were perfect from the start, but because they were rebuilt from their failures, tested against the alternatives, and proven, again and again, in conditions no laboratory can fully replicate. War does not reward the rifle that performs best on a clean range under ideal conditions. It rewards the rifle that a tired, frightened, undertrained soldier can still make work when everything else has gone wrong. That is a low bar to describe and an extraordinarily difficult one to actually clear. And it is the real reason this one weapon, born out of a program that once threatened to disgrace everyone associated with it, went on to outlast almost every rifle sent to replace it. If you like this type of content, don't forget to subscribe. More of this is coming.